Hi and welcome. You may have noticed that certain Republican leaders have evidently decided that coming out against masks and vaccines during a pandemic is a winning strategy. The Republican governors of Texas, Florida, and Mississippi, for example, have taken particularly strong anti-mask positions. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves said that this new federal recommendation for people to wear masks indoors is foolish and harmful. Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order prohibiting government entities, including schools, from mandating masks. Florida Governor DeSantis heavily criticized the idea of wearing face coverings in Florida schools. He even went so far as to threaten to cut funding to schools that require masks. Not surprisingly, these states are seeing dangerous spikes in COVID cases, including among children. Mississippi reported that 0 adult ICU beds remain statewide, and the state's only pediatric hospital, the Children's of Mississippi, is now full, including with children in ICUs and on ventilators for life support. The University of Mississippi Medical Center warns that Mississippi's hospital could fail in 10 days. In Florida, within 24 hours, 3 Broward County teachers and 1 assistant died of COVID. I won't give any more examples. You get the idea. This seems short-sighted, right? It's hard to see how this can be good politics when a disproportionate number of anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers die or become seriously ill with COVID. It also seems short-sighted when the citizens in these states, Texas, Mississippi, Florida, and others, die in high numbers. In fact, a question often asked is, what is the endgame? I'll offer an explanation, but first consider how well the anti-mask, anti-vaccine nonsense plays to key segments of the Republican base. It plays well with white evangelicals who embrace Christian nationalism and believe that God will protect them from illness, and if God doesn't, well, that's God's will. They tend to have a fatalistic attitude, like this anti-mask person who said, I almost feel like if I'm going to get COVID and die from it, then so be it. It also plays well with the segments of the Republican base that is anti-science and anti-government. Tony Spell, a pastor who made a national name for himself protesting COVID-19 rules in Louisiana, told Life Tabernacle Church congregants this, I'll just tell you today, if being anti-mask and anti-vaccine is anti-government, then I'm proud to be anti-government. Cole Beasley said, everybody is so all in on science now, more than I have ever seen. What happened to God's will? A headline this week read, How Ron DeSantis' COVID response became the model of what not to do. The problem here is that leaders who embrace a far-right ideology are not equipped to deal with a real crisis. They only know how to handle a manufactured crisis like critical race theory or Hillary Clinton's emails. That's why Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. They don't know how to deal with facts and reality, which of course is a natural result of rejecting science and academic authority. It's also a result of the fact that far right-wing ideologies are based in myth and lies. In the United States, that would be the myth of white supremacy and the myth that there was a glorious past when America was great and we must try to return to that mythic past, which of course is Trump's whole slogan, Make America Great Again. They only know how to manipulate myths and lies. People like Trump and DeSantis are accustomed to making up their own facts and being affirmed by their favorite media outlets. When a real crisis hits, they don't have the tools to deal with it, so they minimize it. Sometimes they contort themselves to minimize it, like this person who told me that the number of children who died from COVID is statistically insignificant. The next problem. They don't believe that the role of government is to make lives better for people. That's why they spend their time in office doing things like trying to take away health care. They don't like taxes because they don't want to fund social programs. They run for government on an anti-government platform, although they're not really anti-government. They think it's fine to use the government to do things like ban critical race theory in schools. They just don't like the regulations that stop white men from cheating and that even the playing field to make things fair. One of my followers on Twitter asked me this: Terry, if they don't think the government should try to help people, what do they think the purpose is, and why do they get involved? Where do they think our tax money should go? Well, they don't like taxes, for one thing. The best way to understand it is to think of people as either fairness people or hierarchy people. Now, a lot of what I'm about to tell you I learned from Yale professor Jason Stanley's book on fascism called The Politics of Us versus Them, and also a few of his talks available on YouTube. Some people think nature naturally forms a hierarchy. The strong and capable end up at the top, and the others, the weak, at the bottom. When a government tries to help people, they think the government is boosting the weak at the expense of the strong. That's why they deride these kinds of government programs as handouts or socialism or communism. For them, the purpose of government is to maintain the hierarchy. If you think nature forms a hierarchy, you don't think equality is possible. What they think is that other people are trying to replace them at the top. This even has a name: replacement theory, or white genocide. Representative Scott Perry tried to articulate this when he said, "For many Americans, what seems to be happening, or what they believe right now is happening, is what appears to them is we're replacing national-born Americans, native-born Americans, to permanently transform the political landscape of the nation." By native, he didn't mean Native American. He meant white Protestants. Tucker Carlson said this: "I know that the left and all the gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. But they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it. That's true. Every time they import a new voter, I become disenfranchised as a current voter." For hierarchy people, the purpose of government is to allocate power. When they're in power, they try to grab more. They cynically assume that everyone sees government this way. Fairness people, on the other hand, believe that fairness and equality are possible. So they look to the government to issue regulations to keep people from cheating and to even the playing field. Hierarchy people think such regulations are evil because they think these regulations are upsetting the natural order of things. They think these kinds of regulations are taking away from the people who deserve more and giving to the unworthy. Hierarchy people don't like rules or regulations that prevent them from doing as they please because they think they are, or should be, at the top of the hierarchy. So nobody tells them what to do. Of course, they're fine with telling other people what to do, those lower beings who don't understand, for example, that America was meant to be white and Christian. I quoted this a few weeks ago from Christianity Today, explaining the view that America is defined by its white Protestant past, and that we will lose our identity and our freedom if we do not preserve our cultural inheritance. They think they'll lose their freedom if America stops being defined as a white Protestant nation. That's why they spent years and millions of dollars investigating 4 deaths in Benghazi, but they minimize hundreds of thousands of deaths of COVID. They didn't really care about the 4 people who died. They were weaponizing the government to consolidate their own power. They're also not really anti-government, as explained in this Christianity Today piece I've been quoting. While they're opposed to the government doing things like mandating masks or vaccines, they're fine with the government banning critical race theory in schools. As the Christianity piece says, government should take active steps to keep America white and Protestant. That, for them, is the role of government, to consolidate white power. This hierarchical view of the world also explains the hypocrisy of someone like Ted Cruz, who introduced a bill to ban mask and vaccine mandates, but put his own kids in a school that requires masks. In the view of hierarchical people, the families who can't afford private school are not protected, because if you can't pay, you don't get. Still, it seems odd. Won't it hurt them with their base when their own anti-mask policies cause their constituents to suffer? The explanation for that comes from Yale University history professor Timothy Snyder. He coined the word pseudopopulism to describe a pattern he noticed, a strategy used by right-wing governments. Here's how pseudopopulism works. First, the leaders enact policies that hurt their supporters. Second, they identify an enemy. Third, they blame the pain on these enemies. Here you go. Ted Cruz tweeted, "In South Texas, we're seeing COVID positivity rates rising, and it's a direct result of illegal aliens being released into communities." Another example. Senator Rand Paul posted a YouTube video claiming that masks don't limit the spread of COVID. YouTube suspended him for a week for that. Then he claimed that Democrats are taking kids from down at the border who may have COVID, and they're plucking them up and putting them all over the United States as if they're wishing to seed the country with a new variant. It's an awful thing to do. One more example. After taking a stand against masks, Florida Governor DeSantis then blamed Biden and immigrants for the spread of the virus. Joe Biden has the nerve to tell me to get out of the way on COVID while he lets COVID-infected migrants pour over our southern border by the hundreds of thousands. No elected official is doing more to enable the transmission of COVID in America than Joe Biden with his open borders policy. Aside, no, the borders are not wide open. And yes, the Republicans do hurt their own constituents and then blame the enemies. You see, the problem that the Republican Party has is that their policies do hurt their constituents. A bit of historical context. Heather Cox Richardson, historian, has written about our history of oligarchy. Our first oligarchy was slavery, when 1% of the population controlled most of the nation's wealth and all three branches of government. The second oligarchy was the age of robber barons and business tycoons from after the Civil War until the New Deal. The tail end of the second oligarchy came in the 1920s when income inequality levels were extremely high. This income inequality chart from economist Thomas Piketty and published by The New Yorker tells the whole story. In the 1920s, income inequality was very high. Then it flattened out between the 40s and the 70s. Then in the 80s, it took off again. Okay, back to the 20s. We got out of what Heather Cox Richardson calls our second oligarchy with the New Deal. The New Deal offered protections for workers and safety nets like Social Security. That's when we got the minimum wage. The New Deal also regulated businesses in ways that kept businesses from cheating and hurting people. The New Deal lifted a lot of people out of poverty, and as a result, our income inequality levels evened out. Ever since the New Deal was enacted, Republicans have been trying to roll it back. By the 1950s, the Republicans had a problem. The New Deal was popular. So what could they do? They solved the problem through what has been called the Southern strategy. I've talked about the 1950s as a turning point. That's when the Supreme Court decided Brown v. Board of Education, which marked the end of racial segregation in America and the start of the modern civil rights movement. Nixon and Reagan figured out that they could win elections with unpopular economic policies if they lured angry whites into their party. It worked. Reagan was able to achieve large electoral majorities because the electorate was still mostly white. Look what happened to the income chart after the Republicans were able to win elections with large electoral majorities in the 80s. Income inequality started opening up again. Reagan cut taxes and rolled back regulations on corporations. He did this by putting forward a lie called trickle-down economics, which says if you give lots of tax breaks to corporations and rich people, the money will trickle down. As you can see from the chart, it doesn't, and it didn't. Now that the Republican Party has openly embraced white supremacy and people like the Proud Boys and insurrectionists, the Republican Party is whittling down to a few radicalized segments. So they've backed themselves into a corner. They have to play to this base, a base consisting of radicalized, anti-science wingnuts. It's all they've got. They also have to lie, because if they try to have a fact-based discussion, they'll lose. The facts are against them. Their policies hurt people. One of my followers on Twitter asked me this: is there messaging for these folks the GOP is harming to help them save themselves, to see through the crap? These lies and tactics work because the lies and tactics speak to the underlying fears of their base. When Republican leaders like Ted Cruz or DeSantis blame COVID on immigrants, many of their followers know it's not literally true, but for them it's metaphorically true. They think America is being ruined by immigrants. I don't mean to suggest that the Republican leaders are anti-mask because they're smart and playing three-dimensional chess. Many of them do these things and say these things because it comes naturally to them. They are their base. They are scared of immigrants. They do think they're being replaced. They do think that demands for equality for minority communities means that they're in danger, that someone is trying to replace them at the top of the hierarchy. They hear demands for equality as an existential threat. A real-world crisis stemming from something like a virus pulls back the facade and shows the Republican governing strategy for what it really is. It's nihilistic. It's based on a governing strategy that says the purpose of government is to consolidate power and to maintain what they think is a natural hierarchy. It does appear that the Republican Party will continue shrinking and becoming more radicalized as moderates who can't stomach what they've openly become flee the party. As moderates flee, they'll be forced to cater to an increasingly radicalized base. They'll then become even more unhinged from reality, unhinged from science, and more dangerous. The silver lining is that they're shrinking. Unfortunately, they'll probably never disappear. All we can do is keep beating them back.